Welcome to the first day of this online conference on the science of consciousness that is jointly organised by the Essentia Foundation, the Sentience and Science Foundation and the Institute for Advanced Study at the University of Amsterdam. Consciousness is one of the most challenging questions that we face in science today. The dominant model for studying it has been reductionist materialism that holds that everything in human experience, including consciousness and everything in it, meaning, values, love, can be explained in a bottom-up manner from underlying matter. But science is changing. Increasingly, other metaphysics are being seriously considered in trying to understand these phenomena. And that is what this conference is all about. So I am Sarah Durston. Consciousness has always been a passion of mine. In fact, it's probably the reason I became a psychologist. I'm going to be moderating today and on Thursday, and on behalf of the three organisers. The Sentience and Science Foundation was founded last year by me and my friend and colleague Leonika Terpstra. And we aim to bring together first and third-hand perspectives in exploring consciousness. The Essentia Foundation is equally young and aims to promote idealism as a serious alternative metaphysics for understanding consciousness. And the UvA Institute for Advanced Study, the University of Amsterdam Institute for Advanced Study, is an institute dedicated to providing a haven for researchers free from constraints of disciplinary boundaries to work collaboratively on complex scientific and societal challenges. So I'm very excited and honoured to be able to introduce a host of eminent speakers at this meeting, all of whom have interesting and very relevant things to say on this subject. So welcome to today's speakers, Steve Taylor, Bernardo Kastrup, Helene Slachter and Henk Barendrecht. We're going to have 25-minute presentations with 10 minutes for questions from other speakers and also from you, the audience, that you can enter in the chat. Which is not a lot of time, but we have a panel discussion planned at the end of the session, 40 minutes, when we will be happy to take lots of questions and ideas from the audience. So with no further ado, I'd like to move on to our first speaker today. That's Dr. Bernardo Kastrup. Bernardo is the Executive Director of the Essentia Foundation. His work has been leading and encouraging a renaissance of metaphysical idealism, the notion that reality is essentially mental. He has a PhD in philosophy, on ontology and philosophy of mind, and another PhD in computer engineering. As a scientist, he works on CERN. Oh, okay. I am to speak, keep going, okay. As a scientist, he worked in CERN and he worked for the Philips laboratories. He has published widely on this topic, including many academic papers and books. In fact, he writes books faster than I can actually read them. And his ideas have been featured in a host of online podia, such as in the Scientific American and the blog of the American Philosophical Association and many more. Bernardo is planning to speak on how brain imaging can inform us and is informing us on the nature of consciousness. And it is in a very different manner than you might think.
I have a lot of material to cover, so I don't have time to repeat anything. I'm not going to rush, but I'm not going to repeat anything. So I hope you stay with me, focused for the next 25 minutes. I want to talk about the laboratory evidence we have today on the physicalist hypothesis that brain activity generates or is consciousness in some way. What does this evidence actually tell us? Now, the physicalist hypothesis, I can just have a quick look at the chat because I see that there is a message, which is probably for me. Okay, so we are good to go. So the physicalist hypothesis, as I said, is the hypothesis that it is brain activity that accounts for the existence of subjective experience. Because after all, if you have non-detectable brain activity, that's clinical and legal grounds to declare you dead. And presumably, somebody who is dead is not experiencing anything. And there is also abundant empirical evidence for strong correlations between experience and certain patterns of brain activity. Now, it's true, and some people are very quick to point this out to me, that a brain that is completely active everywhere, correlates with a grand mal seizure. So what's going on there? Is it the case that experience is not only activity? No, that's not the case. Under physicalism, experience is activity, but under physicalism, only the neurocorrelates of experience need to be active for consciousness. There are other kinds of brain activity, perhaps even inhibitory brain activity, which do not correlate with consciousness under mainstream physicalism. So if you reduce inhibitory activity, you may end up with more consciousness. But by inhibiting the inhibitory activity, you will disinhibit the neurocorrelates of consciousness. So you still need more activity in the neurocorrelates of consciousness if you have richer or intenser experience. And even in a grand mal seizure, for all you know, people do have experiences that they later cannot remember. We know today, for instance, that certain things that used to be associated with unconsciousness actually correlate with conscious activity. Syncope or passing out correlates with conscious activity. Dreamless sleep, we've known now for 2 years, I think, that it also correlates with other types of experience that are not dreaming. So this is physicalism. If I go now to the next slide, oops, this one. I'll just point out some of the more sort of spectacular research showing correlations between experience and activations of certain brain areas. This one was published a few years ago, and it shows that if you put a dreaming person, a dreaming subject in a functional brain scanner, you can even tell from the scans of brain activity what the person is dreaming of, even if it's something as boring as dreaming of looking at a statue. That can be picked up because it correlates with certain patterns of brain activation. And this word activation, which I'm pointing out here, is an important one, and you see why later. There's another research of 10 years ago which showed that if you measure brain activity of lucid dreamers and you ask them while they are dreaming to dream of clenching their hands, you can pick up a clear signal of brain activation in the sensory motor cortex, which goes hand in hand with the dreamed up experience of clenching a hand. So these are strong correlations. They are so strong that now we can train artificial intelligences to produce an image of what you're dreaming or what you are seeing or what you're imagining. And that's what you can see in this figure here from a recent Russian study. If I activate my pen, hopefully I'll show you better. For instance, this is what the subject was actually looking at, some domino pieces. And you put an EEG cap on the subject and you take measurements of the EEG signal, you feed it to an AI, and this is what the AI guesses that you were looking at. And it's a pretty accurate guess. Same here. If you're looking at a waterfall, the AI guesses it pretty well. These were images that were already seen during training, but when you're not training, you're inferring. The neural network can still infer well based on patterns of brain activation. This is somebody looking at the front side of a car from inside. And this is what the neural network has inferred. You can see here on top, you can see the wheel, you can see the rear view mirror, you can see the windshield, you can even see the road ahead here, this road. So there is a mass of studies showing that there are correlations between experience and brain activation, which substantiates the physicalist hypothesis that experience is generated by brain activation. So it's an instance in which correlation does mean causation, or that's the story. But of course, this is a white swan theory. It tells you that there are only white swans, that all experiences correlate with patterns of brain activation of the neurocorrelates of consciousness. So if you find one confirmed black swan, you have dismissed that theory. And as it turns out, there are lots of black swans. I will speak for some length of time about the studies on psychedelic neuroimaging, but that's not the only thing I would talk about. And so bear with me on this. Back in 2012, a study was done with psilocybin, or the active ingredient of magic mushrooms. And it turns out that there are only brain deactivations showing blue when the subject is undergoing a psychedelic trance with reference to, of course, the placebo baseline. There is only blue. The brain only becomes less active. Not a single part of the brain, which might correlate with the neurocorrelates of experience, not a single part of it activates, becomes more active. And this has been confirmed by a number of studies. Now, what is remarkable about it is that we know that the psychedelic experience is enormously intense and rich from a qualitative first-person perspective. A study at Johns Hopkins a few years ago has shown that the psychedelic experience consistently scores as one of the top 5 most meaningful, memorable experiences of one's life, hand in hand with the birth of the first child or the death of a parent. So these are very rich, very intense experiences, but they correlate with the brain essentially going to sleep. Now, this has been confirmed in multiple different ways. I'm not going to mention it all, but there are multiple papers replicating this result for a variety of psychedelics, LSD, dimethyltryptamine, a number of different psychedelics using a number of different brain imaging methods like fMRI or MEG. Some are better for spatial accuracy, others are better for temporal accuracy, and they all consistently show the same. I will show one more result here. This is for LSD, and instead of fMRI, an MEG cap was used. And you can see that for all the different frequency ranges, there are only deactivations of the brain under psychedelic versus the placebo baseline. And if you look at the total power spectrum here below for the different frequencies, you see that consistently placebo correlates with much higher activation than LSD. There is a tiny little point here in which that's not the case, but that's well within the error margin. If you look carefully, you will see the error margin as a slight red shading around the red curve. Now, what is interesting is how this is portrayed in the media. Let's start with this specific study that I'm showing now with LSD. There was another picture in this study which didn't have blue and green, but had orange and red. But if you look carefully and read the paper, you see that they are not showing brain activity here. This is not brain activation shown in orange with respect to the placebo baseline. This is V1 RSFC, which is increases in resting state functional connectivity in the primary visual cortex. In other words, activity reduces significantly under psychedelic, but what activity does remain, it's more functionally coupled. In other words, it correlates more with activity in other different areas of the brain. That's what this picture is showing. It's not showing a brain lit up with activity like a Christmas tree. It's only showing that the residual activity that remains under psychedelic is more functionally coupled with other areas of the brain. Now, there were several pictures, 5 pictures in this article. This one was the one picked by The Guardian when they discussed the study. So they reproduced the picture here with some important changes, like they completely removed any reference to what the picture actually shows. They consistently removed references to V1 RSFC, which could be justified because you have to explain what this is, and they didn't want to explain. So what do they say instead? They show that there is lots of orange in the picture. That's what they chose to say. Look, lots of orange. Now, which reasonable, educated person reading this casually would not conclude that this is showing that LSD lights up brain activity as if the brain were a Christmas tree? And this is a problem because it conveys as a conclusion the opposite conclusion of the study. This is not only inaccurate, this is a complete reversal of what the study tried to show. Now, is this the only instance of this? No. CNN covering the exact same study, and I took a snapshot of this, this is still online. They literally say that the brain lit up with activity. No, on the contrary, the brain went to sleep. But if you are an educated reader who doesn't read the technical papers, but the science press, you are being told the opposite of what is being found. There's more. Let's look at another study from 2014. This is a study done in which they try to evaluate variance and total spectral power of brain activations. Now, what's variance and total spectral power? The difference between variance and activity is the same as the difference between acceleration and speed. Variance is the first derivative of activity. In other words, it tells you how much the activity signal is changing, not how high it is. If you're riding a motorbike in traffic, your speed will change a lot. You come to a halt, you accelerate, decelerate, because you're negotiating traffic in a city. So your speed variability will be much higher than the speed variability of a 747 flying at cruise speed in good weather. But the speed of the 747 will be much higher than the motorbike. The variability will be higher in the motorbike, but the speed will be higher in the 747. So what this paper studies is brain activity variability, not the total brain activity level. It's impossible in the methodology of this study to measure or to say anything about activity levels because they discard, this is a technical point, they discard phase information in the spectral signal. So you just do not know. We can only make a statement about variability. So how was this portrayed then by the Washington Post? This is a quote from that article in which the Washington Post says that they've quoted the second author of this study. And according to them, this second author said that you are seeing these areas of the brain getting louder and more active. It's like someone's turned up the volume there. He talks about hyperactivity. Well, that's not at all what the paper says. The methodology of the paper is fundamentally incapable of making statements anywhere near this. But the Washington Post says that they're quoting one of the researchers. So I went further and I looked at this essay in The Conversation, a kind of academic blog. The same person has written this. This is out of his own pen, and the same second author. And if you look there, he's saying the same thing. He's saying psilocybin increased the amplitude or volume of activity. It didn't. It increased activity variability, which is like acceleration is to speed. It's a completely different thing. He insists, he says, activity became louder in the emotional system. Well, the paper says nothing of the kind. So when I saw this, I contacted the first author and he confirmed to me by email, I still have the email, that I am correct and this is false. And this second author was in that email list. Eventually I asked him, why don't you correct at least the conversation piece? He argued that the word activity is ambiguous enough that it could mean activity variability. I disagree with that. I think there is no sense in which acceleration is like speed. And for the same reason, there is no sense in which activity variability is like activity. Moreover, in the same paper, in the same essay, he does use the word activity in the correct sense. So he is then using the word activity in two completely different senses in different paragraphs of the same essay. This is at the very least gratuitously misleading. Moreover, he talks about a hypothesis that is a well-known way of physicalists trying to reconcile their theory with this data. He says that, okay, activity reduces in certain areas of the brain, but what is being reduced might be inhibitory neural processes, which will then disinhibit brain activity that actually correlates with consciousness. If that were the case, there should be an increase in activity signal somewhere in the brain, even if on average activity decreases. We should see something in red somewhere and not just blue everywhere. But his own studies show that this is not the case. So, of course, this all raises the question, why is this being communicated like this? I mean, and this is a sincere question for me. I'm not saying this rhetorically. Why don't they just, well, tell the truth? You know, it's not too complicated. Now, all these attempts to find other things that increase in the brain under the psychedelic state have been done, a number of them. Activity variability was one. They've also tried functional connectivity, as I talked about briefly, but they converged on a hypothesis called the entropic brain hypothesis, because they found out that there is something that reliably does increase in the brain under psychedelics. And that's what they call diversity. They also call it complexity, entropy, big names. But what is meant by this is just noise, okay? That's all that it means. It's brain noise. It's brain activity that doesn't fall into any recognizable pattern. It's just like a TV set to no channel. It's just brain noise. And brain noise increases a little bit. You see here, this is post-drug and this is post-placebo. So on this scale here, it seems that the drug reliably increases noise a little bit from most of the pairs studied. So the attempt is to account for the phenomenology of the psychedelic trance based on this tiny increase in brain noise. Now, there are a number of ways, a number of reasons why this is completely and entirely implausible. The first one is obvious. The increase that they are talking about here is tiny. It is minuscule. It's an increase of 0.005 on average in a scale of 1 to 100. It is minuscule. It's statistically significant. I will not dispute that. They had lots of pairs. I could argue that statistical significance is a completely arbitrary factor. There are many academic papers today who no longer accept submissions based on statistical significance. But I don't need to go to even go there. I can accept the statistical significance, but all that it shows is that there is an effect. It doesn't show that the effect is significant, or that the effect is large. And it's not large. It is incredibly tiny. Moreover, in some of the drug placebo pairs they studied, noise went the other way around. Noise reduced, and the subject still had the full psychedelic experience. So this is a black swan case. You cannot account for the psychedelic trance on the basis of noise if in some cases noise went in the opposite direction that your theory requires. There are other problems as well, of course. So we talked about other studies of the neurocorrelates of consciousness that show that brain activation is enough when you're dreaming of looking at a statue or clenching a hand for researchers to be able to correctly guess that. So if brain activation is the basis, the physiological basis of consciousness in all those cases, is it plausible that there would be a completely different physiological account of consciousness in the case of psychedelics alone? I mean, this is like creating a new theory every time you have new data. This doesn't work. It turns your theory into something unfalsifiable. And there are other reasons why this is completely implausible, but I'll leave it here. Now, it's not only psychedelics that show this, and the brain damage can also correlate with enriched or expanded consciousness, so to say. This is a study done 11 years ago in Italy, published in Neuron. They studied patients that were going to undergo surgery for the removal of tumors, which always causes some collateral damage in surrounding tissue. And they scored these patients for a measure of self-transcendence. It's a score of how much your own subjective being identifies with something beyond yourself, an expanded consciousness, so to say. And post-surgery, consistently, this score of self-transcendence increased. In other words, there was an expansion of consciousness post-surgery, especially for damage caused in certain specific areas of the brain. And if you check it against the controls, there is no such change. It remains in the margin of error. Now, since you're talking about brain damage, what about Vietnam War era veterans with brain damage? Turns out that in a study of more than 100 of these veterans, it has been shown that damage to the ventromedium, I think, prefrontal cortex correlates with religious experience. So again, damage correlating with a sort of expansion of consciousness. This was a study done in mediums that claimed to be able to write down information coming from some transcendent source. I reserve judgment about this interpretation of what's going on, but the study is objective enough. They put mediums, which they call experienced mediums here, in a brain scanner and compared with a control group, which for political correctness, they called less experienced mediums. And they asked these people to write down information from a transcendent source, which requires engagement of several brain areas related to logical thinking, syntax, grammar, writing. And for the mediums, brain activity in all these different areas went down consistently. And for the controls, it went up, as you would expect. And they scored the resulting text for complexity, which certain computer programs can do. And text written by the mediums scored consistently in higher complexity than the controls or than what the mediums themselves could write when not entranced. Journalists observed this and said, well, it's puzzling, right, that you can write more complex text while the areas engaged in the kind of thinking that would be required actually become less active. And I could go on and on, hypoxia caused by partial strangulation, the choking game that teenagers play worldwide to have a psychedelic trip without drugs, or G-force-induced loss of consciousness, in which pilots report memorable dreams, and I'm quoting the exact words from the study, while they are supposed to have passed out to be in syncope. Cardiac arrest patients, even transcranial magnetic interference can lead to out-of-body experiences. Acquired savant, the ability, increased cognitive abilities following lightning strikes to the head, car accidents producing head trauma, even bullet wounds to the head are known in the literature. So we could go on and on. There are lots of black swans that contradict the idea that brain activity is the physiological basis. Brain activation is the physiological basis of consciousness. Most of the times it is, sometimes the opposite is the case. So to conclude, if your theory says that there are only white swans, not a single confirmed black swan will refute your theory, let alone a whole flock of black swans. It's safe to say that we may not know exactly what's going on, but it's not accurate to say that the brain generates experience through neuronal activation. And there are coherent alternatives to this theory that are consistent with the data, including the black swans. And don't have time to go into that, but they do exist in the literature. And the case of psychedelic neuroimaging it is a sort of a case study unfolding before our eyes in the present of how a failing paradigm tries to defend itself by rendering itself unfalsifiable, by producing a different account for every different piece of data. So whatever happens, well, physicalism can account for it because you sort of massage it to account for it on a case-by-case basis. This is not even subtle confirmation bias, it's outright confirmation bias. It's really in your face. These results are repeatedly portrayed by the media and the researchers themselves often enough as meaning the opposite of what they actually mean. And the theoretical hypotheses we are asked to entertain, like the entropic brain hypothesis, they defy any reasonable sense of plausibility. I mean, the size of that effect, the fact that it's not consistent with all drug placebo pairs studied, the fact that it's not consistent with the rest of the neuroscience of consciousness makes it so incredibly implausible, and yet they are treated as award-worthy scientific advancements. This is the current state of play. So the ultimate conclusion is, well, there is something very wrong with this story that brain activity generates conscious experience. And I'll leave it here. Thank you.
First of all, the audience at home, if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat. And I'm going to also invite our other speakers. If they have questions, feel free to pose them. I have one, if nobody else is ready yet. You mentioned coherent alternatives that are plausible. Can you say a little bit more on that, please?
Well, I didn't want to sell my own fish, but since I got the question, my own analytic idealism accounts for this because it postulates that what we call brain activity can be divided in two groups. One, our contents of consciousness, and the other, a dissociative process that accounts for the fact that we are independent, personal, individual minds, and that I can't read your thoughts or I can't know what's going on in the galaxy of Andromeda. So some of the brain activity is actually what this dissociative process looks like under a brain scanner. So if brain activity reduction impacts that category of brain activity, then what you have is a reduction of dissociation. And if you're reducing dissociation, of course, you are expanding awareness, because dissociation is what constrains awareness. And ordinarily, for survival reasons, our awareness is very constrained, very focused on what's useful for survival. But if you impair through whatever means, artificial or otherwise, the brain activity that actually corresponds to the dissociation, of course, you will expand awareness. You will bring into awareness things that are otherwise discarded because they may not have a operational survival function.
Okay, thank you. We have a comment in the chat from Titus Smedes, who wants to compliment you on this excellent and very interesting presentation. And Steve has a question. Steve.
Yeah, thank you, Bernardo. That was a very insightful presentation. Thank you. I wanted to ask you actually about animal consciousness, because animals have less complex brains than human beings. I guess we can surmise. They're smaller brains with fewer brain cells, probably with fewer interconnections and neural networks and so forth. So, you know, would it be possible to imply that because animal brains are less complex, they are more conscious than us because there is less dissociation?
I understand the spirit of your question, of course. I'm not sure. And the reason I say this is because I think the complexity of the brain in us has to do with our higher level mental functions, our ability, for instance, to explicitly introspect, to metacognize, or to become explicitly aware of our own mentation, logical reasoning, symbolic thinking, the ability to deal with language, to represent, even to represent representations in the form of linguistic symbols. And I think the complexity of the brain is related to that, to those higher order mental functions. I think consciousness itself is there from single-celled organisms onwards. And then the question is an amoeba or another single-celled organism less dissociated than we are? I don't know. I think it's plausible that they are not. I think it's plausible that they are just as dissociated as we are. I think metabolism is what dissociation looks like. I think life, biology, is the name we give to what dissociation in an spatially unbound field of subjectivity underlying all nature is, what dissociation in that field looks like. We call it life, we call it biology. So all life would be dissociated in that sense. Now, that said, I would agree with you if you were to point out that some social insects like ants and termites seem to operate on the basis of some kind of meta-mind. They seem to coordinate their behavior in a way that's difficult to account on the basis of chemical clues alone, given the necessary localization of these chemical signals. So that could suggest a lesser degree of dissociation, but I think that may be the result of an evolutionary pressure to reduce dissociation in those kinds of animals, and not related only to the fact that they are simpler than us.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Helene, I can see you've got a question, but we need to move on. So can I ask you if you would please hang on to it until the panel discussion at the end. And the same for the people who are posting questions online. Okay, thanks very much again, Bernardo. That was very interesting indeed and very provocative.